Good evening, everyone. It's Wednesday night. Happy Hump Day, everyone. Got my animal shirt on, and we pulled out some soundtracks tonight. Soundtracks are an interesting animal. Some of them are entertaining for one reason or another. Some are just classic music. I got a kind of have it all over the map here, but we'll go through what I got here. So. Right in the background, if you can hear a little bit of it, it's the soundtrack to Popeye with Robin Williams and Shelley Duvall, and we'll get into why I like that a little later on. But let's start with Man from Hearst soundtrack, classic 70s movie with Richard Harris. Full on Richard Harris going on there. I'm not sure who the composer is on this, to be quite honest. But I know it was quite a seller in the 70s. And I remember the movie scaring me when I was a kid, but I was pretty young. And let's see. One of my favorite movies you don't see very often. I'm not even sure if it's available on DVD, but American Hot Wax. It was kind of the Alan Freed story, kind of retold. Had a lot of comedians for some reason. Jay Leno, Lorraine Newman's involved in it, and a lot of rock stars. Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis actually performed in the movie. There's a very young Jay Leno there. Chuck Berry from St. Louis is in the film, and you can never go wrong with the movie. It has Screaming Jay Hawkins, but it's kind of a retelling of retelling of one of Alan Freed's concerts from the 50s. And it had that a lot of the artists were still live performing. There's a live concert on side one, and side two is original mono tracks. This one's a quirky one. This album is a very young Paul Shaffer. I believe it came out mid-70s before he signed back on to Saturday Night Live. It was a 13-episode TV series in which Paul Shaffer, I believe, is like an assistant to the devil, and the other young Greg, who's the young man in the show. I can't remember what his name was. It's a Norman Lear production, but apparently he cut a deal with the devil to be a pop star. And Paul Shaffer was kind of the devil's assistant in the film, and he was involved in a lot of music. It's kind of cheesy and weird, but it is. I think you can probably find some episodes on YouTube, but it's a full-on Norman Lear sitcom trying to get into the rock and roll market. This is a classic soundtrack from a classic kind of hippie movie. Bob Dylan was in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Had a lot of people from the band, and Bob Dylan was very much involved in all the music in this album. Pretty much, like I said, it's a classic soundtrack, but always nice to have on vinyl. The original issue with the kind of the relief cover. Another movie I remember seeing in high school, I believe I went to the theater. I was probably like the only person to go see this, Americathon. It actually had some pretty decent music. And an odd group of people had Harvey Korman, Fred Willard, Chief Dan George. For some reason, I was obsessed with him in high school. Nancy Morgan and Zane Busby. Zane Busby is the woman here, and she is the woman in the van in Up in Smoke. I was a well-known improv actress for many years, and did quite a few films. But everyone always talks about how amazing she was, and I believe she performed live on this album as well. And Meatloaf was in this film. There's a fun soundtrack album. I believe it was reissued on CD. I think I have it somewhere when we get to CDs. The Beverly Hillbillies cast album. So it had everyone involved in that, in the TV, the primary characters. And they did a little bit talking and actually performed some songs on there. But it was definitely a tie-in, and they were cashing in while they could. one of my another movie I enjoyed quite a bit actually, and still do from time to time when it comes on is Explorers. It's a very sweet movie actually. Kids and they're going around and one of my has one of my favorite covers by Robert Palmer doing the Little Richard song "All Around the World." I'm not sure it's on any other Robert Palmer album, but it's got some nice tracks. Less Than Perfect by Red Seven, very kind of 80s, and it's a Jerry Goldsmith soundtrack who did tons of soundtracks. One I don't know much of the history, but it's a movie called Body Slam, put out filmed by Hemdale. Interesting. And it had a lot of, I do know very little bit about it, but it does have Bachman Turner Overdrive when they had reformed a band called Kick, and then a couple of wrestlers singing as well. It might be a movie worth looking up. It even has Lou Albano from the. And then the soundtrack to Where the Buffaloes Roam, I believe it's one of the first films about Hunter S. Thompson. I don't think it's highly regarded, but is what it was. And Neil Young did a lot of the incidental music for this film. And had Bill Murray and Peter Boyle playing his kind of counterpart there. It's been very Bill Murray was kind of trying to break his first kind of break into more dramatic acting. MGM's Wonderful World of the Grimms, an interesting album. Pretty standard music for a children's movie, but the interesting thing is it is in Cinerama, which I believe there's only 8 to 10 films that were shot in Cinerama. Once How the West Was Won, I believe, is one of the other ones. It's an interesting film technique. We'll get into that when I get into film sometime. But actually, there are only a couple of theaters you could watch it in, and there were you had to have 3 screens side by side to get the full panoramic effect. It was very complicated, and it's very expensive to make, but it was very interesting film technique. It's just kind of a generic old album with background music for silent films. So if any of you out there are working on neat music for films you're making, background music, let me know. You can get this on CD for you. It was remade a few years ago. It was a hit, but here's the original soundtrack, True Grit, and had Glenn Campbell, and he actually sang the title track and had a pretty good hit with it. And they're even advertising the book tie-in here. Paramount Records and like 74. I don't know a whole lot about this. I just know there was a Broadway play sometime in the 70s. And good grief, Charlie Brown, Peanuts. And it does not involve any of the people who made the soundtracks to TV shows. Music composed and conducted by Fred Karlin. I'll have to listen to this again, but it was a Broadway play, I believe. Just a simple classic. Henry Mancini, Breakfast at Tiffany's. Again, of course, it's Henry Mancini. He did a ton of soundtracks in the 70s and had some other hits. Did the Pink Panther, Baby Elephant Walk from, I believe that was a John Wayne film. Atara, I believe. And then the original soundtrack from Sunshine. I looked this up. It is a pretty full-on 70s melodrama, if you're interested. Shot on film and looks pretty much the same as the album cover looks, if you're interested. St. Elmo's Fire. Pretty much everyone my age or a little bit younger probably has a copy of this buried somewhere on cassette or might even CD. It was coming around about the transition time. Part of the Brackpad albums. John Parr had one of his hits on there. He only had a couple. I think he wrote a couple for other people. David Foster. There it is. This one I know very little about. It's on United Artists. I think it is French. It says it was a U.S. release, but it just had a very 70s look to it, so I went ahead and picked it up. And let's see. Music composed by Armando Travolci. One of my favorite TV shows from junior high and high school, or more junior high. Buck Rogers, the remade version, put out by Ken Larson. It was kind of his follow-up after Battlestar Galactica, trying to still kind of cash in on Star Wars, and he did a pretty good job on it. Original soundtrack to The Black Hole. Actually, not a bad soundtrack. Maximilian Schnell was in it. Anthony Perkins was a really not the best film, but Disney was trying to cash in get on the Star Wars thing. John Barry did the music. Interesting thing, this is actually one of the very first albums, especially with a full orchestra, that was completely recorded digitally. And it's kind of its claim to fame at this time. This album was actually John Paul Jones, and I'm going to show Jimmy Page's album right after it. So this is about a year and a half after Led Zeppelin broke off, after John Bonham's death. And John Paul Jones was sitting around and this more and more record movies, was looking for people to do soundtracks, and he got introduced by Jimmy Page to them, and he did for this movie Scream for Help, probably like early 80s. It's actually pretty hard to find. I'm not sure it was ever released. Some pretty decent music. He even had John Anderson of Yes sang on a couple of tracks, and Jimmy Page did some guitar, and he did a lot of the other instruments. But it's actually not a bad album. I listen to it from time to time. And this is the album Death Wish 3. I'm sorry, Death Wish 2. Get your Death Wish mixed up sometimes. Jimmy Page did the soundtrack to there, and as I said, it was shortly after Led Zeppelin had broke up. He was trying to find something to do. This was actually on Swan Song. There's some interesting stuff. They gave him free reign. If you actually watch the movie, it's not the best movie, but he did a very good job of, like, if there's a radio in the background or something else, he composed music just to be in the scene in the background, and got a couple of pretty well-known people from England to do some of the singing, and it's actually a pretty decent album. I bought this probably mid to late 80s. This was put out by a strange little label. They put out as the soundtrack to the film, but it's actually just a dub of the audio track. The movie is in public domain, so it's a dub of the audio track of Plan 9 from Outer Space. So if you don't feel like you want to watch the entire movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space, often considered one of the worst of all time, you can sit down to the album and listen to a large part of it play through. I'm not sure there was ever much music in it, but you can listen to it. And then a couple of pretty rare soundtracks. This one's a little beat up, but in the late 60s, early 70s, the American International Films was cranking out the biker movies and horror movies. This one's The Savage Seven. And Cream and Iron Butterfly is on a couple tracks. And it was actually on Acto, which is part of Warner Brothers. And Roger Corman was cranking out these movies. And some of them have some pretty well-known soundtracks. This one's the Wild Angels. This one's a little more well-known. And had Dave Allen and the Arrows. A lot of people know. And this one's actually had enough of, and Mike Curb, the producer, had some hits in the 60s. Well known enough that it was actually reissued as a record store day a couple of years ago and was selling for like $20. Nice thing. It's even on Tower Records, which only put out a few albums in the 60s. But and this had Jane Fonda and Nancy Sinatra. I'm sure you can watch the trailer or part of the film on YouTube if you want. It's pretty cheesy by today's standards, but it was a full-on biker movie at the time. I actually have the DVD. Hey, maybe I can figure out how to stream that sometime. And finally, before we leave tonight, I'm gonna Popeye soundtrack, which the movie did not do the best, but the music is pretty amazing in this. It has a lot of the stars singing the songs, but it was a Robert Altman film. He wanted to do this for a long time, my understanding is, and but he hired Harry Nilsson to write the soundtrack, and he did it and worked with Van Dyke Parks, and it's actually a very amazing soundtrack all the way through. And I had a bootleg of it for a long time, download, but they put out a record store day about a year ago of the actual demos he did, which were almost even better than this because it's got Harry Nilsson performing it, and it's actually one of his last projects. All right, that's all I have for this evening. Hope you enjoy what I'm doing here. A little bit of distraction. Again, to all the people I know working at the hospitals, please stay safe. We need you all here when this is done. And if there's anything you'd like me to pull out or something interesting you'd like to see, I'm happy to do that. I've got a lot of weird crap that I've gathered over the years, and happy to ramble on about it if people are interested. Again, take care and have a wonderful evening.